Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Freser. We're pleased to welcome Robert Kanigel, freelance writer, retired MIT professor, and author of Eyes on the Street, The Life of Jane Jacobs. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here.
Robert, I asked you on because Jane Jacobs was a towering figure in New York where I grew up, and I was thrilled to read your biography of her. Until I read it, I didn't fully appreciate what made her such a hero to both leftist community organizers and free market enemies of central planning. And for listeners who may not be familiar with Jane Jacobs, I'd like you to start in the middle of the story with her epic battle against the most powerful man in urban planning history, Robert Moses. I mean, he was Lex Luthor to her Superwoman.
Really? Or David versus Goliath, however you want to look at it.
That might be better. Listen, set up these two characters for us in the fight to save iconic Lower Manhattan neighborhoods like Soho, Little Italy, and Greenwich Village.
Yeah, Robert Moses was the master builder, and he built projects, and he built expressways through New York, and he was, even though he didn't have a big title, he was probably the most important, powerful man in New York for many years going, and his ethic was to build, and sometimes he didn't have much interest in the people who were living where he was building. You see, he built an expressway across the Bronx called the Cross Bronx Expressway, and expressways all around New York, and one of his big projects was going to be a big highway through Lower Manhattan called the Lower Manhattan Expressway.
And he just mowed neighborhoods down.
That's essentially what he did. Robert Caro wrote a famous and quite wonderful book called The Power Broker in the 1970s that told the story of Robert Moses and what he did. And Jane Jacobs in the early 1960s had to confront him because what Moses wanted to do is to shove an expressway through Lower Manhattan that would basically have eliminated large areas of the city that have since become tremendously popular and strong. So it was going to go through Broome Street in Lower Manhattan. And the whole Loft District, all of Soho would be gone. Little Italy would be threatened, would probably be gone also. And Jane stopped him.
How did she stand up to him?
She worked with, there was a church, there was a religious leader in the area who approached her. She had just come off a successful battle to block her own neighborhood from being labeled an urban renewal district. And the word had gotten around about this woman who just stood up to authority. And so he approached her, and she became very active in the fight and became really the co-leader of the fight. And over a period of years, stopped him. Moses was beginning to weaken. People were beginning to see through the bluster and the bluffery and sometimes the cruelty of what he did. And so Jane certainly came along at a good time as far as that goes.
You know, her victory was legion. Why has it taken so long to get a full-length biography of her life?
Why does it ever take so long for a biography to come along of a person? There were a couple of other biographical treatments. There was one wonderful young adult book about Jane called The Genius of Common Sense, but there was no full-length biography. I'd grown up hearing about Jane Jacobs, and I grew up in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn. In fact, I was going to high school at the time that Jane was fighting some of her battles and writing her famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So she was always sitting in the back of my mind as a potential subject for a biography.
For those just joining us, we're speaking with Robert Kanigel, author of Eyes on the Street, The Life of Jane Jacobs. So, Robert, let's go through her life and the key points. You write that Jane honed her fighting skills against mindless authority through her battles with public school teachers in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where she grew up. I understand she was expelled from the third grade?
Yeah, Jane once said that her teachers in her first and second grade were pretty good, and then it went downhill after that. She always had trouble with school. She didn't do well in school. She had no patience for what seemed like these dictatorial pronouncements from on high in the form of her teachers. And one time she did, in fact, get expelled from the school when a public health person was coming around the school trying like a good person to encourage the kids to brush their teeth. And at one point he asked them all to swear up and down, promise that they would brush their teeth every day for the rest of their lives twice a day, which is a good thing. But Jane's father had the day before, or soon before, said, Jane, now you should never promise something that you can't expect to keep. And Jane, after the public health guy had asked everybody to sign on, Jane went around whispering, don't sign it, you can't do it. And this, of course, got her teacher very aggravated, and one thing led to another, and Jane was briefly expelled.
I understand she defied the expulsion.
Yeah, I'm not sure defied the expulsion would be the right thing. But the way Jane handled it was that she did come back the next day, and she came to think that maybe her teacher was probably glad that she did, because maybe the teacher didn't want any hassle either. So she arrived the next day, and there were no repercussions. But Jane came away from this experience feeling like she'd been an outlaw. She'd been sort of at the edge of the school society as an outlaw, and she realized that she felt comfortable in that role.
Well, her parents encouraged her rebelliousness, giving her a typewriter at age 10, which launched her career as a teenage writer. She really had a gift for words, didn't she?
She did. Even as a kid, she was writing, she wrote poetry, she had some of her poetry accepted, and her original impetus in moving to New York was like the cliched story of going off to the big city to become a writer, and that's very much what she wanted.
And she moved to New York City in 1934, which was pretty much the bottom of the Great Depression. She landed her first job as a reporter working for nothing. Where did all this gumption come from? Yeah,
the job as the reporter was back in Scranton, where she worked for a year unpaid for the Scranton Republican, the newspaper there. And then when she moved to New York in 1934, she got a whole series of jobs that she'd lost one after the other, not because of anything she did, because, as you say, it was the middle of the Depression, the depths of the Depression, and most of her employers would go out of business in a few weeks. So she just barreled back. She kept on working at it. And at one point, she found herself in the Fur District, and she started talking to a local. New York City is divided up into a lot of commodity areas. One of them was the Fur District. There was the Flower District and the Diamond District. One of them was the Fur District. She ended up writing an article about it for Vogue magazine, which was the first of 4 of these, and really helped get her a start in New York writing. What caused Jane to fall so desperately in love with New York City? I think New York did. I think she wound up in Brooklyn. She would try in the mornings to apply for jobs. She'd go out on calls, maybe take a typing test or something. But at some point, the work of the day was over, the looking for a job, and she'd prowl around the city and get off at one of the subway stops in New York, climb up the stairs and come up to street level and start prowling around. So one of the times that she went prowling around the city, she wound up at Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village, which she didn't even appreciate at the time was Greenwich Village. She went up to the street level, she walked around, and she liked it. She liked walking the streets and the handicraft shops and the streets going off in strange directions. And it was an adventure for her. And she went back to Brooklyn later that day or a day later and told her sister, hey, we have to move there. This is where we should be. And they did move there, and she lived in 3 different places in New York City over the next 34 years, from 1934 to 1968, and all of them within 500 yards of the subway stop that she had gotten out that day. Robert, Jane Jacobs authored many books, but her seminal work was her 1961 magnum opus, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Its impact on turning the tide of urban renewal bulldozers that were creating postmodern monstrosities that sapped city life was epic. Describe the scope of that book. It's an amazing book, and in writing my book, I got tired of quoting the many people who said something like, I read The Death and Life of Great American Cities and my life was changed. The shades fell from my eyes. I never saw cities the same way again. And that was my experience in reading it, and I think it was the experience of thousands of people. What Jane did was go into the New York around her and see it through new eyes and cast aside all of the, or many of the assumptions, planning assumptions that went through the day that she felt were tearing the city down. And she came away with new prescriptions for how cities could work at their best. For example, one of the most obvious is that the whole suburban mentality of the post-war era was that of separation and wide open spaces. And what you want to do is get off into the green spaces and spread out on half-acre lots. And that was the good life. And Jane said, well, maybe that's one version of the good life, but it's not the only good life. And another kind of good life is the urban good life, where people are crowded upon one another, that they run into each other a lot, but in return, this surprise, this adventure, this excitement in running into people on the street and in the sheer density and diversity and excitement of that kind of a city neighborhood.
Well, Death and Life had something like 3 chapters just on sidewalks.
Yeah. Yeah. She, like I said, when Jane got into something, she really got into it. And she would look at the width of sidewalks and say, one kind of play activity will work on a narrow sidewalk, and other kinds of play activity would work on a wider kind of sidewalk, for example.
How was Death and Life received by the urban planning intelligentsia when it was first released?
Well, I'd say it got a mixed greeting. Some people could see that that nothing like this had ever been seen before, and had the same reaction that I and many other people did, that this was the way and the truth and the light. Not everybody, though. Some people said that this was, we're turning our backs on all the wisdom of the latest generation of city planners. This is a regression. This is not the way. One person, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, said that in past times, anybody who had the temerity to say the kind of things that Jane Jacobs said in Death and Life would be written off as a witch.
My parents grew up during the Great Depression in what were called railroad apartments in an ethnic ghetto a few blocks from what became the East Harlem projects that you and she write about. My parents' childhood memories are uniformly positive. It's like they grew up in a reconstructed village. How did the great high-rise urban renewal projects help destroy the social fabric of the people who lived there?
What Jane noticed, and not just in East Harlem, but in other areas in New York, was that, you have to step back and remember that these projects were put up with good intentions. There were slums in the world. There were tenements that were sometimes infested with all sorts of bad things, that were sometimes dark, where rooms gave onto an areaway that had absolutely no light whatsoever. So there were reasons why these projects were put up. But along the way, much harm was done. And these huge projects, impersonal and sterile, very often eliminated the first floor shopkeepers. Not very often, practically always, eliminated the first floor shopkeepers. So that in many of these projects, it was purely residential. There was nothing there but one apartment packed on top of another with no street light. There was no reason to be on the street because there were no shops. There was no activity. And people found it to be the sterile, blank kind of thing that it was.
Plus, from a security perspective, there were no eyes on the street. I remember visiting my grandma, and out the first floor window, there was always this little old lady leaning on her pillow, watching everybody go by.
Sure. And you didn't have that in these projects, which were typically 12, 14, 16 stories high. And Jane made a big name for herself when she gave a talk at Harvard in 1956, when instead of seeing what planners would typically see as the stark differences between the lower income housing projects of East Harlem and the middle income and, upper middle class income projects that kind of look the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Jane said, no, they're not so different. They're the same. They bring the same sterility to the neighborhood around them.
For those just joining us, we're speaking with Robert Kanigel, author of Eyes on the Street, The Life of Jane Jacobs. So, Robert, Jane rose to quite a bit of fame in her time, which she used to fight City Hall. That ended when she was arrested in 1968, eventually fleeing the country. Describe that incident and her decision to ultimately leave the city she loved.
Actually, it didn't end in 1968. When she got up to Toronto, when she moved there, she got into battles over expressways even there. In New York, there was a big hearing. This was in 1968, again on the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which had been beaten back once, and now Jane often said that if you want to beat an expressway, you often have to beat it 2 or 3 times, and that was the case with this one. It had come back in a new form, backed by new champions, and they were still trying to do it. And there was a big a hearing at this school in New York, and Jane felt that the whole hearing was conducted in a way that had a preordained conclusion, namely, this is going to be great for New York. And she made a stink about it. She invited people up onto the stage that hadn't been invited onto the stage by the people conducting the hearing, and brouhaha came out of it. And at one point, Jane was arrested.
Well, and I think they accused her of starting a riot.
Yeah. When she just claimed, I was speaking up for myself. I was perfectly polite. I was ladylike. But the result was that it was a confusing moment in the local life of that city. And the people up on the stage basically said, arrest that woman. And she was.
Your book points out that her decision to leave wasn't just because of that fight, but her sons were reaching draft age, which was the height of the Vietnam War, and part of the decision was she didn't want them sucked up into that.
I think it was all the decision. I think while she was, frankly, exhausted by her battles in behalf of New York and her neighborhood and against the expressway, her husband, Bob, looked ahead to the prospect of their sons being hauled away to jail for not going to fight in Vietnam. And the whole family was virulently against the war and couldn't abide as any parent would, couldn't abide the thought of their kids being in jail. And so one day in 1968, they piled into the car and drove up to Canada. And there they lived the rest of their lives very happily as Canadian citizens from 1968 to Jane's death.
People don't remember that 50,000 Americans did leave over the Vietnam War.
That's right.
So how long did Jane carry the fight on in Toronto against urban planners?
I don't think she was against urban planners per se. I think she was against particular stupid acts of urban planning. And I think that was her attitude about almost everything, that we don't want to get caught up in abstractions and generalities. We want to look at specific instances and what's happening in real lives to real neighborhoods at the present time. And that was the perspective she brought to everything. And she found plenty of examples of it in Toronto, in particular something called the Spadina Expressway, which would have, in fact, gone right through her neighborhood.
So, Robert, it was clear from reading your book that you really marinated in the life of Jane Jacobs, came to understand her up close and personal. Sum up her life for us. What do we owe Jane Jacobs?
I think we owe Jane some specific ideas about cities and some specific ideas about economics, which she also wrote about. But I think in a larger sense, we owe her the example of a fearless person who is willing to stand up to anyone and who listened to her own internal account of how the world worked and didn't accept abstractions and generalities coming from on high, and instead insisted on looking at the world as it was.
Well, she was certainly an inspiration to me, many other people. Robert, I thank you for coming on the show, and thanks for writing that book.
Thanks very much.
That was Robert Kanigal, author of Eyes on the Street, The Life of Jane Jacobs, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearfuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company located in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.